Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr Gillian Cook. Gillian, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Good afternoon, Dan.
So cool to have you on. Really looking forward to having a conversation with you about all things sports psychology and coaching. Let's get started by getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience.
So I'm a lecturer in sport and performance psychology at Liverpool John Moores University, which involves teaching and research, which specifically my research examines the psychology of performance excellence and high performance leadership, usually looking at things such as how effective leaders create the conditions for others to thrive and deliver optimal outcomes in high pressure environments. I also work in applied settings as a sport psychologist, so across Olympic, Commonwealth and professional sports, from football, athletics, hockey, tennis, swimming, a wide variety of sports and interests. So my certainly research absolutely feeds into my applied practice and the other way around. So that's a little bit about me.
What's your background before sports psychology, Jill? How come you're a sports psychologist? What brought you to that?
So originally, my undergrad degree was in psychology at the University of Aberdeen, and I went on to do my master's in sports psychology at Loughborough University, carried on to do my PhD in sport performance psychology again at Loughborough University. But if we go back before that, I went over to America to play tennis as a teenager and went over to IMG Academies in Florida. And I worked with a sports psychologist myself, and he helped me so much with different things on the court that I then wanted to help other people in the same way that he'd helped me.
Very much like my background, but in the world of golf. I'm always tempted to ask sports psychs with a sporting background about their own psychological challenges. I had plenty, that's for sure. If we were to get in a magic time machine and go back to you as a junior tennis player, give me a mark out of 10 for the mental side of the game that you'd perhaps give yourself. What was good and what could have been better, and what did you work on with your sports psych to get better?
I'd say that the area that was lacking was more my technical talent.
Okay, fair enough. I know about that one as well, to be fair.
It's the usual areas around, ensuring that you're going into a match with a good positive mindset, confidence that you're able to adapt to your opponent and ensure that how you're playing is a way that's going to hopefully lead to winning outcomes. But as I say, my physical skills down.
So, and I think this is an interesting thing, isn't it? Because when I reflect back on my golf, I was pretty much the same. I always say I was okay technically, but my ball striking as a golfer could have been a lot better. And I stood in awe watching some of my contemporaries rip the ball down the middle, sort of 320 yards, and I wasn't quite achieving that. But you do wonder how much that interplays with the psychological side. You in golf, you're not quite hitting the sweet spot like others are all the time. You're watching others. That vicarious experience actually diminishes self-belief because you're looking at others doing it so much better than you. And there's that. They're inextricably linked, aren't they? The technical, physical, and mental side of the game. So it's all very well me saying, "Well, give me a mark out of 10 for mindset," but actually the technical side is so linked to the mental side that it could actually emanate from there, can't it?
No, absolutely. As you say, all those different areas are completely interlinked. How you're thinking and feeling on specific days, so how you're applying yourself in training or not, how you're relating to your coach, obviously tennis is an individual sport, but in a football example, how you're relating to your teammates, how you're able to, within football, it would be great if you could just have one fantastic player and that would be, but you don't, it doesn't work that way. You need 11 individuals to absolutely work together as a team to understand how best to work with other people, which again, you can be as talented as you want. If you're not able to work with others and work with others effectively, then it just doesn't translate into optimal performance. So certainly to me, psychology goes into absolutely everything, which is why it's a subject that I am absolutely fascinated by, and I just found so interesting because it leaks into, and even if you think about physios or doctors, the way that they will speak to athletes if they come in injured, what are the first things they say if they're coming back from injury? How is that doctor or physio relating to the athlete? Is that going to undermine performance, maybe enhance anxiety around coming back, or are they speaking to that athlete or a footballer, whoever it might be, in a way that's really reassuring and helping with their performance? So to me, psychology cuts across all the sports sciences, which is why I find it such an amazing area to be in, and feel very fortunate to work within the area.
Clearly, Jill, that's why it's the most important of the area of sports science. Clearly, that's why the biopsychosocial drives everything else, right? We know that, don't we?
Certainly, alongside the other disciplines in a way that is, really exciting. It's one part of performance. I'd love if, you could work with someone and if it was just psychology, but and that was all that mattered, but it's how psychology and how everyone relates within that larger system that, as you say, leads to the great outcomes that we see on a weekly basis.
We were about to have a whole raft full of sports scientists switch off there, but you brought them back there with your politically correct answer, which is quite right. We all work in an interdisciplinary team, absolutely, 100%. And you've mentioned some really pertinent words there, like communication and relationship and leadership, and that's what we're going to talk about today, aren't we? We're going to talk about coaching. We're going to talk about a couple of papers that you've published in 2021. They're papers that I've found absolutely fascinating to read. And these papers are about the psychological aspects of coaches, specifically Olympic swimming coaches. Tell me a little bit about the genesis of these articles, Jill. I mean, I've just given a tiny brief description there, but talk to me a little bit about the genesis of these articles, and then perhaps we can launch into a more of an in-depth analysis.
So these papers are from from my PhD at Loughborough. That's where the papers and the group of studies came from. So originally, my involvement with British swimming started at my master's. So looked at the perceptions of coaches and management within British swimming, of sports psychology, what experiences they've had with sports psychology previously, and equally what they would like, looking forward into the future. So findings, that came out of that were things such as involvement with coaches. Yes, swimmers or athletes are absolutely performers, but coaches are also performers in their own right. They operate in highly pressurized environments, and they have to manage individuals, teams, organizational issues. So there's a huge amount to coaching that sometimes in sports psychology we can be very focused on the athlete within a system and forget the system and the individuals operating around them. And that work was won the British Psychological Society's Division of Sport and Exercise Psychology's Master's Thesis of the Year award. So from that, I went on to carry on with doing a PhD again with British swimming. And really, I sat down with Nigel Redman, who was the head of people development at British swimming at the time. He's now moved back to England rugby. And we sat down and had some great discussions back and forth, really thinking, what can I do? What can we do together that will help British swimming, that will help British swimming achieve performance goals, environmental goals, and really what can be done that's theoretically sound, but also a really great applied bit of work. So we threw some ideas back and forward, and just, really where the conversation led to was, we know that, athletes are obviously the ones that are in the pool and delivering performances, but coaches have an essential role in that athlete's success. So what can we learn more about? How can we better support our coaches with their performance, with their well-being, to ensure that they're thriving, but also that they are then creating the conditions for others to thrive and deliver optimal performances? And there was a series of papers that came out of that. So that's a bit of a tour into how these studies came into being.
And the papers we're going to talk about very much centre on examining the psychological aspects of Olympic swimming coaches.
Yes, so it's really looking to understand, as you say, the psychological attributes of coaches and the effect of those attributes on elite performance. So the thing that we were particularly interested in is the systematic review that published in 2020, which looked at the papers that had looked at psychological functioning of Olympic coaches and its relation and the relationship of that to, was it facilitative? So was it beneficial to athlete performance? Was it debilitative? So were these traits harmful towards athletes' performance, or is it sort of a neutral, non-categorized? You know, whether you have that or you don't, if you're behaving in that way or you're not, it doesn't seem to make a huge impact on performance. And one of the big findings that came out of that systematic review was that the studies had looked at coaches as an entire group of coaches. It was, we're looking at Olympic coaches and that's it, and we'll look to find out different things from these coaches and, you know, assume that that's going to be the same across the different levels. But if you look at certainly Lou Hardy and colleagues' work, the Great British Medalist Project in 2017, they looked at athletes of differing levels of success, so compared medalists to non-medalists in a matched sample, and they found there were psychological differences between athletes that had attained higher levels of performance success and those that hadn't. So we had so in my supervisor, Dr. David Fletcher and Dr. Mike Peregrine, we had the thought that if there's, you know, psychological differences between athletes at the highest level of performance, then it may also lead that there might be similar differences between coaches at the highest level of performance. And instead of comparing coach, you know, their psychological attributes to general population norms, it's really important that you're comparing like with like. So, you know, really comparing, so certainly where these papers looked at was comparing world leading, so Olympic, you know, coaches that had coached athletes to win Olympic gold medals versus world class coaches, which are coaches who have trained athletes to the Olympic Games to win silver or bronze, but not Olympic gold. So really, certainly one of the things that I find so exciting about these studies is that it's really comparing the elite to the super elite. And you don't tend to find that in literature. So that's when we can really unpick some really exciting things that are coming out of that, because they're comparisons that are very real at that level and in that environment.
Gotcha. So essentially, what psychological aspects do coaches possess that positively influence performance, or could be to the detriment of athlete performance, in this case swimming? You differentiated between world leading and world class, and if I heard you correctly, world leading were coaches who had coached an athlete, a swimmer in this case, to an Olympic gold. World class was defined as coaches who had coached athletes, swimmers, to the Olympic Games, but not necessarily to an Olympic gold. Did I hear you correctly?
You are absolutely spot on. Couldn't summarise it better myself. As you say, there was 36 coaches in the sample, and collectively they had coached 169 swimmers to win 352 Olympic medals, of which they collectively coached 90 swimmers to win 155 golds. And from the swimmers that in the swimmer paper, 38 Olympic swimmers, of which collectively they'd won 59 Olympic medals, of which 31 were Olympic gold medals. So an absolute wealth of knowledge and experience within that sample.
Just incredible. And before we go into the specific details of what you were actually striving to measure, what psychological aspects, I mean, this has we had Sergio Lara Bercial on the show talking about, you know, his research. Does this bear any kind of relationship to Sergio's work? I'm not too sure if you know about it. Is there a relationship there at all?
Certainly read an awful lot of his research as I was going through my PhD, and some really great studies, a great series of studies that he did with Cliff Mallet, who's based over in Australia. And their papers were, there was one case study that looked at one specific coach and went through his personality characteristics and the traits and sort of characteristic dispositions. But there was also another two studies that really took inspiration from, where they spoke to the coaches themselves, so serial medal winning coaches, but they also spoke to their highest achieving athletes. So really building a picture of, which is certainly what we did here, that it's great to speak to coaches to get an idea from self-reports. If you go back to Hogan's, his 1991 socioanalytic theory of personality, what Hogan suggested is that you've got self-reports. They say a lot about someone's internally, how are you relating to your own intrapersonal. You've got that knowledge of how you internally are viewing and experiencing the world, but you've also got other, observer reports. So in terms of your behaviours, how is it that you are typically behaving, interacting with others? What are the observable things that other people can see? So to really build a fuller picture of coaches at the highest level, we thought it was really important to speak to coaches themselves. How do you see yourselves? But also speak to their highest achieving swimmers. So how are swimmers viewing, their coaches, their personalities, their typical behaviours, how they the coach-athlete relationship, cultures. I was fortunate that the research, so I travelled across 3 different continents, so over to Australia, America, in Europe, and had the opportunity to sit down with live interviews with coaches and swimmers and really see the culture that was being created in these different training environments, and certainly learning so much from these incredibly accomplished individuals.
Incredible. And that's so important to say here, that we're talking about 2 research papers, aren't we, back to back. We're talking about coaches engaging in self-reported measurement around these psychological aspects, which again we'll go into detail about in a second. And then, as you said, so coaches detailing their sort of discrete characteristics. And then the second research project was the athletes themselves, the swimmers themselves, reporting back on the overt behaviours that they experience on a day-to-day basis. Correct?
Absolutely.
So, right, what were you measuring? What specifically were you looking at? When we say psychological aspects, okay, fine, but what were they?
So we looked at 3 specific psychological areas, one being personality. Personality, how someone is, someone's distinctive pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Use the Big 5 model, which certainly the most used model across psychology within personality. So that's looking at someone's openness to experience, their tolerance of ambiguity, imagination, creative thought, conscientiousness. So that's usually someone's dutiful behaviour, how hardworking are they, someone's extroversion, so more sociable, gregarious, potentially dominant, agreeableness, so that's about someone's propensity to trust others, cooperation, care. So in terms of a motivational disposition, keener to get along rather than get ahead. And also neuroticism, so that's your tendency towards negative emotions. So looked at the sort of the Big 5 personality characteristics, but then understanding a person is more than just a constellation of those traits. There's more things that go into that. So we also looked at the dark side, so the dark triad as well. So obviously, everyone's got light characteristics, dispositional hope, dispositional optimism, but there's also the darker side to individuals thinking, feeling, and behaving, and particularly as different reports were coming out at the time about some coaches' behaviours were adversely affecting athletes, teams, and the wider organisation, and the dark triad hadn't really been looked at this. It's been looked at in a couple of papers, but to get a broader understanding of the darker side of the psyche. So it was looking at Machiavellianism, so that's your propensity to lie, your keenness to exploit others and manipulate. Psychopathy, so that's when someone has low empathy and they typically will lack remorse or guilt. So think of serial killers would be a great way to think about what a typical psychopath, think of Silence of the Lambs for thinking about psychopathy.
Were there many Hannibal Lecters in the world of swimming?
I have to report that no one scored, everyone was very low in psychopathy, so please report no Silence of the Lambs.
We'll come to the results in a minute. I couldn't help myself there. Sorry, I interjected. So we got Machiavellianism, we got psychopathy.
And narcissism, so that sort of grandiose sense of self and sort of demand for admiration. And the final area that we looked at, coaching, yes, there's the technical skill of coaching, the tactical skill of coaching, but also, coaching is about being able to positively influence others, of which emotional intelligence, how are you, responding, how are you identifying others' emotions to begin with, how are you interpreting them, how are you expressing emotion, and are you able to regulate your own or others' emotion, and particularly in a highly demanding, highly pressurized Olympic environment, but we can translate this across to other sports as well. Within these highly pressurized environments, how are people able to use emotions? So looking at people's responses to their own interpersonal and intrapersonal information. So our coach is able to show empathy and understanding and adapt to the emotional needs of athletes. So there are the three different areas that we looked at. So the big five personality traits, the dark triad, and emotional intelligence. And we looked at were there differences between world leading, so Olympic gold medal winning, and world class, so Olympic non-gold medal winning coaches.
A couple of questions before we get on to the outcomes here. Emotional intelligence, were there specific inventories? Did you go back to the Salivary stuff, or were you Goldman, or what did you use?
So the emotional intelligence scale that we used was the Schutte Emotional Intelligence Scale, which is the most widely used emotional intelligence scale in sport, 33 item measure. So what that scale's picking up on is perception of emotion. So are people able to perceive the emotion, the messages that people are communicating, management of own emotion. So are you able to, for example, feel particularly anxious in a situation, but then modify that because that might not be the most appropriate emotion in that environment, management of others' emotions. So you're able to have a swimmer that's particularly anxious before a final. That anxiety is not facilitative to their particular performance. Anxieties we know can be a good thing in some circumstances, but if that coach is able to understand that anxiety is not good for performance, can they help that athlete reappraise that emotion, problem solve to help them with their emotional state? And finally, utilization of emotion. So our coach is able to be in particular emotional states and really utilize that emotion to go on to do more positive things.
I'm going to fractionally put you on the spot here, so many apologies in advance. And I don't know if this might not be something you can answer from an empirical perspective. It might just be an opinion, and if you don't wish to give your opinion, that's absolutely cool. Do you think it's interesting because you've got a research project that has the big five, and you're measuring big five, and you're measuring emotional intelligence? But did you find at all, would you suggest or suspect that emotional intelligence loads onto the big five?
So certainly the personality traits of the big five, they don't exist in a vacuum. You not just these traits and, that's all it is. There are lots of different interrelationships. Typically, if you will load higher on agreeableness, you may be higher on emotional intelligence. So there's certainly quite a number of different relationships that have been found in the literature that suggest that depending on what people's traits are, with equally agreeableness will typically correlate with lower narcissism. So there's quite a number of different relationships within the existing literature that suggests that it'd be great as psychologists if we only ever had 5 things to measure. That'd be fab. Our job would be much quicker. There's so many different things, and they all interrelate. Everything is different things have different effects on others. And for example, you can be. What's exciting about this research is nothing is necessarily just a straight relationship. If you're high on this, then that will lead to this. It's what's the effect of these different, as opposed to a more, just looking at one particular thing. It was trying to bring in as many different aspects as possible to build as full and as realistic a picture as possible to hopefully help psychologists and coaches and leaders and people within different organizations with their own organizations and practice.
Absolutely. So to summarize, you've proverbially gone around the world. You've had the opportunity to sit down with some of the best swimming coaches on the planet from different continents, world-class and world-leading. And you've also interviewed athletes. We'll get to that one in a second. But with this first research project, you've asked these world-class and world-leading coaches to fill in questionnaires around personality, the big 5, the dark triad, and emotional intelligence. And you're looking for differences between world class, so those who have taken athletes to Olympic Games but not necessarily won medals, and then world leading, who have helped athletes win gold medals. So, Jill, tell us, what were some of the differences that you think that you found?
So the significant differences really just meaning that the differences weren't found by chance, were across 5 different areas. So the psychological factors that discriminated Olympic gold medal winning coaches from Olympic non-gold medal winning coaches were agreeableness. So, that was around propensity to trust, keenness to get along with others. The world leading, so Olympic gold medal winning coaches were higher on that.
This was the self-reported, yes? This was them who were reporting on themselves.
Yes, so when coaches were judging themselves and thinking about themselves and how they relate to themselves in the world, the world leading coaches came out as higher on agreeableness. The world leading coaches came out as lower on Machiavellianism. So again, that's the propensity to exploit others, to manipulate. They came across as lower on that than the world-class coaches. And the world-leading coaches also came across as lower on narcissism than the world-class coaches. So narcissism, that grandiose view of yourself, seeking admiration, seeking prestige. And in terms of emotional intelligence, the world-leading coaches, so Olympic gold medal winning coaches, came higher on perception of emotion, so perceiving other people's emotions, but also management of own emotion. So in terms of how you're able to appropriately recognize what your emotional response, identify and recognize what your emotional response might be, but then manage and regulate it so it's potentially more appropriate for that particular environment. So world leading coaches higher on agreeableness, perception of emotion, and management of emotion, management of own emotion, but lower than world-class coaches on Machiavellianism and narcissism.
Before we unpack that, really interesting that conscientiousness isn't there in terms of the difference between world-class and world-leading.
Yes, the number one trait that is related to leadership effectiveness, so if we go to the organizational psychology literature, is conscientiousness. It's related to not just leadership emergence, but leadership effectiveness. And we didn't find that within this study, but what it may have come down to is everyone was scoring highly on conscientiousness. It wasn't so, one where everyone was lower, everyone was high on conscientiousness, because again, to me, that's an artifact of the sample, that everyone is really performing at the highest level, in one group, you've got Olympic gold medal winning coaches, but in the other, silver medals, bronze medals, swimmers getting to the Olympics. And to do that, to thrive within an environment that is highly pressurized, you need to work incredibly hard. You need to set and attain incredibly high goals. To me, it makes sense that everyone would be very high on that trait to then go on and operate in this kind of environment.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I completely agree there. I suppose looking at the outcomes there, so again, the frame of reference here is the self-reported measurement of the psychological characteristics. So the self-report from the coaches themselves, the world-leading perceive themselves to be more agreeable than world class. What's your thoughts? What were your conclusions? What were your thoughts on that one, Joe? That's an interesting one,
It
isn't
is
it?
an interesting one because when you look at the leadership literature, this tends to go against some of those findings within leadership that agreeableness typically doesn't tend to correlate with organizational leadership outcomes. So if we're thinking about organizations, if you might be managing thousands of people. It's an organization that you're managing. However, agreeableness is about, to be a top coach, you're collaborating with not just an athlete, but it's joint action with other coaches, with sports science, with your performance director, with the head of coaching. So it's about building relationships. If we look to Sophia Jowett's work on athlete relationship, certainly one of her, in her 3C+1 model, of the coach athlete relationship, one of those elements is closeness. And how is closeness manifested? It's manifested in mutual trust, respect, and that interpersonal appreciation, of which are core elements of agreeableness. So to me, it absolutely makes sense that an attribute that would contribute towards forming and maintaining close, positive relationships and would facilitate positive interpersonal interactions, because every day coaches are with swimmers or coaches are with any athlete. It's a very close relationship, and you're always trying to push the boundaries of performance and keep trying to get better. And the closer you are, the more trust there is, the more care there is between those two parties, the more discretionary effort that swimmers or athletes will put in. They won't be second guessing, is my coach saying this for ulterior motives? Is it to do with, do they actually care about me that much? Is it, you don't have to double think any of the motives behind what the coach is asking you to do, because you can trust that they genuinely believe this is the right thing to do. They care about me as a person, a human being. We've got a great relationship. Therefore, my discretionary effort will be higher. And the more discretionary effort there is in training sessions over the years, over the cycles, the higher the chances that those athletes go on to win gold medals.
I think there is a real. I think it's interesting. It suggests to me a potential difference between world class and world leading could be that capacity to acknowledge that one has to socially adapt or socially flex according to who's in front of you, and and as you say, it lends neatly towards the work of Sophia Jarrett, who has been on the Sports Psych Show to talk about her 3C+1 model and that closeness and complementarity, and I just think that's fascinating, isn't it?
As you say, as a top coach, it's one analogy that you might use is that it's about having 20 different keys to unlock the potential and the motivation of 20 different athletes. You might be able to relate in a particularly great way with one individual, but it's being able to do that with different personalities, different motivations, different behaviors, and being able to really build genuine trust with that, and build that mutual trust that the coach trusts the athlete and the athlete trusts the coach. They can then build a great relationship to the point that you hear athletes talking about coaches as, gosh, he's like my second dad, gosh, she's like my second mum. These are very close relationships that are built up because each party is pushing each other towards performance excellence.
I'm quite a fan of the work of Colin de Jong at the Minnesota Personality Lab and his work on actually breaking down the 5-factor model into 10 aspects, and the aspects he speaks about or created around agreeableness, found around agreeableness, were compassion and politeness. Taking politeness aside, certainly compassion, having that empathy, seeing the world through your athlete's eyes. That's just so important. It goes hand in hand, doesn't it, with that notion of increased perception of emotion. To be able to perceive the emotion that somebody else is experiencing. It seems like these results are quite reliable because there's a relationship between these aspects, isn't there?
Yes, certainly, as you say, not just relationship between things that you would expect to correlate highly with other areas, but also, as you say, from our own work as applied sports psychologists, some of these findings really seem to resonate with what we'll be seeing when we're out working ourselves, with top managers that we have worked with, and how they tend to. There was an interview that Carlo Ancelotti did, and he spoke about when he was into Everton, and he was building relationships with 50 different people. And how do you build and maintain effective relationships with 50 different people? How do you unlock? How do you understand different people's key drivers? How do you get the most out of other people and really drive that human performance? So again, the findings really, and certainly one of the areas of research that I'm really exploring now, is that these traits and characteristics that are coming out of super elite swimming coaches, I'd anticipate that they will highly correlate within football, within education, within healthcare. Although the technical side of football coaching may be very different, and technically what a clinical lead, a director may be doing within healthcare, technically that's going to be different to how you would teach a backstroke, whatever it might be. That way of relating to other people, driving human performance, helping other people to thrive, I suspect that we may find some similarities.
And so, moving on to this second research project where you spoke to athletes and asked them to fill in these questionnaires around their coaches' behaviours, what they experience of their coaches' behaviours. What were the findings there?
So what we found from the swimmers' perspective, so this is, again, that was looking or working with 38 Olympic swimmers, and at minimum, they'd work with their coach for a minimum of 2 years. So it's not as though they were filling out questionnaires based on a 1 month relationship with a coach. It was, it was between 2 and 10 years that these swimmers had been working with their coaches. So a great level of experience and knowledge of behaviours, not just on a great day. The expression that's always used in football is, it's all fine and well playing well in Barcelona, but can you do it on a wet Wednesday in Stoke? It's the same within, what are people's different behaviours when the pressure's on? You're up at 5 a.m. You're exhausted. So I say highly accomplished swimmers winning 59 Olympic medals and 31 Olympic golds. And what we found was that the swimmers who had been coached by world leading, so Olympic gold medal winning coaches, the world leading coaches, the swimmers perceived that they were higher on conscientiousness. They thought they were higher on openness to experience. They thought they were lower on narcissism, and lower on narcissism than the world class coaches, so the Olympic non-gold medal winning coaches. And finally, they thought that, or perceived their views of their coaches' behaviours, were that the world leading swimmers perceived their coaches to be higher on perception of emotion and higher on management of other emotions. So basically, management of other emotion is that swimmer thinking they can really regulate and help me with my emotions to reappraise situations, that I will then be in a better emotional space before the final to go out and deliver whatever that performance is that led to those great outcomes.
Fascinating. Higher in conscientiousness, I should say, higher in openness, lower in narcissism, higher perception of emotion, and a better ability to manage other emotions. Where would you like to start here unpacking that?
It's to me, it's fascinating just to look at what were the similarities and differences in swimmers' perceptions of their coach, and did they agree or disagree with the swimmers' perceptions or the coach's perceptions. So swimmers and coaches both agreed that the world-leading coaches were lower in narcissism. That the world-leading coaches didn't quite have that same grandiose view of themselves. Although narcissism, this was actually quite an interesting finding, because the world-leading coaches were not low on narcissism. They were moderate on narcissism, and the world-class coaches were just particularly high on it. So one of the findings that has come out from organisational psych literature is that there is an existence of an inverted U-shaped relationship between narcissism and leadership effectiveness. That very low narcissism, not particularly great for leadership effectiveness. And then the more narcissistic you get, the better the outcomes are. Because if you think about a narcissistic person, some of they'll be displaying assertiveness, supreme confidence, and intense desire to succeed, which within a very uncertain Olympic environment is some great attributes to have. That then reaches a tipping point that if it goes over that level, then people that are particularly narcissistic can sometimes act in insensitive ways to others, put their own needs before an athlete's or someone else's needs, and sometimes there could be awkward interpersonal interaction, so detracting from that coach-athlete relationship. So the reason that finding was particularly interesting is it wasn't straight, low versus high. It was moderate versus high. So again, it's unpacking the complexity of some of these findings. That it's not just about being low or high. It was Aristotle's golden mean, where he said that you never want to be particularly low on something or particularly high on something. Usually that golden mean, something in the middle, is usually what leads to superior performance.
Some kind of sweet spot. And there was an interesting, again, I appreciate this may be something you can or can't or would choose not to comment on, but there was an interesting, in the Olympics, there was a clip of a swimming coach whose swimmer had just won the gold medal, and this coach was going absolutely bananas high up in the stadium, watching from above, and there were a lot of interesting opinions about it. A lot of people had sort of commented saying, "Oh, this coach has made it about themselves, and they shouldn't do." And I was kind of quite I tried to be quite rational about it when I was looking at it, because I was just thinking, well, maybe this person can't help being the kind of the extroverted character that person is, bordering on maybe sort of narcissistic tendency, but maybe that helps that person be the coach that they are, and maybe that athlete enjoys some of that aspect of that person's personality. So we need to be careful to discount that side of that person, essentially. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense, and also I suppose it depends how you view that. If you're, everything's the way that we all, you can have 5 different people in the exact same situation, but those 5 individuals may view that situation in completely different ways, and that swimmer may have thought, looked up at their coach and thought, he really cares. Look how excited he is for my performance. We're in it together. We achieved this together. Think of the long journey, the early nights, the early mornings, the late nights. He really, really cares, and that unconditional love and positive regard. So there's lots of different ways, as you say. Certainly on Twitter, there was lots of different interpretations of that behaviour, but certainly from that swimmer's perspective, it may have been that that just showed how much it was a visible outward display of how much that coach really cared.
Absolutely, I completely agree. The high conscientiousness is interesting, isn't it? Because obviously, as we discussed, that didn't come in with the self-reported measures.
Yeah, so what I've sort of mulled that over, why there could be a difference between how coaches are perceiving themselves and how swimmers are perceiving the coaches. And it's all about perception, so that the behaviours that the coaches are displaying, that the swimmers will have been seeing, particular hard work and striving towards achievement, which when you're trying to attain an Olympic gold medal, that's role modeling, and that swimmers able to see that, and they're creating an environment of performance excellence. But it may be that the world leading coaches underrated their own conscientiousness, that they underreported or don't perceive quite how conscientious they actually are. So they may actually have underrated their conscientiousness compared to how their swimmers see that conscientiousness.
They normalise their insane working hours.
Certainly their desire to succeed, to set goals and create plans that, and going dutifully planning and working towards things, and particularly when you're in environments where you're surrounded by other people working in that way, as you say, you can absolutely normalize some of those behaviors.
I'm working 24/7 hours, or I'm thinking about swimming 24/7. That's normal, isn't it? Everyone does that, surely. Hey, I loved a bit in your research paper about the openness piece. Obviously you said that the swimmers had reported the world leading coaches being higher in openness, and you thought about that and thought that might relate to imagination and creativity around coaching ideas and coaching practice. I just think that's fascinating.
Yes, certainly. And I suppose a lot of it also comes down to perception, that whether you're actually more open or not, maybe it doesn't make a difference. Maybe it's just that the swimmer thinks you're more creative, therefore, he or she is coming up with, I'm doing a completely different program to everyone else, therefore you think you have a competitive advantage, therefore you are going to train harder, put in that higher discretionary effort. You think that things, it's also more exciting to think that you're doing something different to someone in the next pool or in the next country or in the next whatever it might be, that thought that you're challenging traditional practices. So to me, that finding was fascinating, because it just really made me think, does it matter if you're actually really doing something different, or if you just perceive that you're doing something different? Because then, as I say, if you think you have a competitive advantage, you think you're doing something different to other people, you will work harder at it, and therefore the harder your work in potentially different ways to others, the more likely you may be to succeed, because you think you're doing something special with that particular coach and that partnership going on to Olympic success.
Yeah, absolutely, and it makes me think that there surely must be an inverted U there as well, in terms of there's a sweet spot, because there must be coaches out there who are so open and come up with so many crazy ideas that their swimmers go, "Oh mate, I can't be doing that. That's insane. I can't think of anything off the top of my head," but there must be an inverted U there as well.
And certainly from some of the top people that sitting down with the Olympic gold medal winning coaches, it's you're not just throwing out different ideas, it's very thought through. There's a huge reading of the scientific literature, pooling different ideas together and almost experimenting. Let's try this, does it work, does it not work? Okay, it's not worked, let's try something again. But really pushing to push the envelope, to do things a bit differently, and having the tolerance of I wouldn't call it risk, I'd call it calculated, calculated risk, calculated decision making. That it's coming from a lot of reading, a lot of thought, discussions with sports scientists, with whoever it might be, and pooling. One expression I've seen of top coaches is that they're guiding the orchestra, and that they're bringing different and pooling different people's ideas together, and they get to see the overview of how this relates to that, to then really go on and be that conductor that creates that higher level of that higher level training program, that environment around that swimmer that will help them thrive and go on and produce medal winning outcomes.
And as a conductor in the world of sport, in the world of coaching, that conductor probably needs to be attuned with emotion. And it's interesting that from your research that there seems to be a perception of difference in emotional intelligence there between leading and world class coaches. That world leading coaches. Swimmers believe that world-leading coaches have an improved perception of the emotions that they might be experiencing. Any thoughts on that?
So to me, so that was one of the similarities, that coaches themselves, the world leading coaches themselves, thought they were higher on perception of emotion, but in that perceiving of athletes' emotion. So if there's a situation that an athlete might be in that's having a particularly adverse emotional impact, if you can recognize that, you can then change that situation, modify or to help change that emotional response in a way that's more supportive towards performance. Both world leading and swimmers and coaches agreed that everyone thought that the world leading coaches were higher on that. But one of the differences was that the world leading coaches themselves didn't perceive any differences between management of others' emotion, but the swimmers did. So the swimmers thought that world leading, so Olympic gold medal winning coaches, were higher on management of other emotion than world class coaches. But again, that would make sense because only you yourself know if someone's managed your emotion. The coaches might think that they're able to manage emotion and to adapt different situations in different ways, but the only people that truly know if those emotions have been managed is that agent themselves. So the swimmers are reporting that the coaches are particularly able to successfully adapt those emotions and act appropriately on understanding, thoughts, feelings, and what's going on. They can then help athletes reappraise situations or problem solve, or different techniques that people might use to help an athlete perform and optimally and feel in the best space for that performance. So for me, the fact that the swimmers reported that really attests to that probably is a really real thing that they feel, because it's them that only you know if someone's managed to alter your emotion.
Do you think this demonstrates the importance of conversation between coach and athlete? That, there are these discrete signals going on all the time, that athletes are perceiving certain things about the coach all the time, and of course vice versa, but that it's useful for coaches to optimize their ability to coach in general and the specific athlete in front of them, to actually get to know, well, in very simple terms, what am I doing well here? What are you enjoying about my coaching? What's going well? What works for you? And actually using these kind of indices as markers to actually, structure conversation essentially.
Absolutely. As you were saying, they're having open conversations, and some of the times they may be, it's referred to as courageous conversations. So difficult conversations with either athletes or with the performance director, whoever it might be, that if you communicate what your needs are, but what you may need back from someone, the more you understand someone and how they may respond in highly pressurized situations, the stronger that relationship will be, the higher the trust, and all these different things feed in to that better relationship that can then drive that performance side. But as you say about with coaches being able to think about and reflect on how they are, certainly one of the implications coming out of these papers, this is the first two studies of four, is emotional labour training is would certainly be beneficial with Olympic coaching. So emotional labour goes back to the mid 1980s. It was Horace who came up with or really looked at the concept originally about, it's really service with a smile. So if you think about people in the airline industry, you might be having an awful day. Things are very difficult in your personal life, but you've got to smile at absolutely everyone coming onto the plane. Someone might be a particularly disagreeable passenger, but you have to act in that way. And certainly with Olympic coaching, the more positive, the more energized a coach is, the more inspirational motivation they can put across, then that is correlated with higher motivation for the athlete. It's correlated with higher performance of the athlete, higher energy within the environment. So the more coaches are able to manage their own emotion and the expression of that emotion, the better that environment will be, and the more conducive that environment will be to performance. And I think it was certainly this work was recognised with a number of different awards, one of them being from the Association of Applied Psychology. So findings such as, the application, so one of the as the Association of Applied Sports Psychology's excellence in science practitioner endeavours, findings such as these, the real applied implications, are some of the sort of exciting things I think people really picked up on from this study.
It really interesting what you've just said. I mean, as you were talking there, it was making me think of coaching as, well, coaching being performative. Coaching being performative. That, I talk to athletes a lot from a perspective of, performance can be an act, not always, but often has to be. And I agree with you. I think sometimes you have to wear, whether you call it a cognitive mask or, however you describe it, it has to be performative some of the time. The other thing, I suppose I'm going to make a bold statement here, as you were speaking and you were talking about the importance of energy, and if we're talking about coaching being performative, actually how, and I don't know if this impinged at all on your research or came into it at all, but introversion, if introversion is can be a lack of positive emotion, a felt lack of positive emotion, how I just wonder sometimes if introversion can be a barrier sometimes for coaches in coaching. That is a raging hypothesis, and nothing other than that, not tested, I'm sure, at all, but didn't know if you had any thoughts on any of that stuff.
So extroversion is an interesting one. There was no differences that came out in extroversion or introversion within elite versus super elite Olympic coaches. But if you look back to the organizational psychology literature, there's a relationship between extroversion and leader emergence, but not with leader effectiveness. So extroverts are more likely to put themselves forward to positions where, leadership positions, but that doesn't necessarily correlate to actually being effective, or it doesn't correlate to being effective within that position. So it's probably not particularly surprising the extroversion didn't come out as a difference, but again, maybe that's a requirement, as you say, for all coaches at that level. You can see that, again, it's not always being, it's about driving, so it's being attuned to athletes, what their needs are and different things at different times, and that will be different. So on some days you might want that quieter word and that more introverted way of relating to others. In other days it might look very different, and being so that adaptability to really cater to the needs on that day of athletes, to me, is a really strong thing that came out of these studies.
I think it's a fascinating world, and you've sort of very kindly, in a way, said to me, Dan, there's absolutely no support for what you've just said whatsoever. And I can imagine that's the case. I think it's really interesting, extroversion, because, again, going back to the work of Colin de Jong, the aspect side of that trait is broken down into assertiveness and enthusiasm. And it doesn't surprise me that putting oneself forward for a leadership role within organisations, and obviously this is away from sports research at the moment, but putting oneself forward for leadership roles is related to extroversion, because it has that assertiveness aspect to it. I suppose it's, as somebody who kind of tests a little bit as introverted, it's that lacking of enthusiasm that can, I suppose, one has to be performative at times if one is a little bit introverted from an enthusiasm perspective.
It's the same, I suppose. It's with any way of relating. If you're, so in terms of feedback that you might give to athletes, if you're a coach, if you're always giving positive feedback, you're great at this, that was fantastic, it becomes less meaningful over time, because I'm always fantastic, so you never really know if what you're doing really was. Whereas if there's from a feedback perspective, you're always pushing and developing, and when you're told that was fantastic what you did, that hard work, that work rate, whatever it was, it will then be more meaningful because it's slightly different. So again, if you're always high on energy, and like really high on energy and motivated and energizing, there are absolutely times for that, but it's also being able to read the room, for want of a better expression, and adapting to that in a way that's going to help others thrive and really deliver in those environments.
100%, and that's classic, isn't it? How characteristics both help you and hinder you. There's not really a bad characteristic or a really good characteristics. It's just that characteristics, but if we move away from the dark triad, if you like, they help you and they hinder you. Essentially, if we're looking at the normal dimensions. Hey, look, absolutely fascinating stuff. I mean, I suppose to finish our conversation here, we've talked about what you found. I mean, what now for coaches? Listening in, reading this research paper, is it just a case really of, and I say just a case, an important thing that comes from this is if we examine the difference between world-leading and world-class coaches, that we can uncover where coaches can shift, where we need to help them adapt, essentially. That's the investigation here. And we can actually help coaches become better from this research.
Absolutely. So, when you look at coach development or leadership development programs, a lot of it is around tactically, how do you coach someone? Technically, how do you coach someone? And it's only now that we're starting to think a bit more about actually the psychology, the psychosocial aspects of how do you influence, how do you build relationships, how do you relate to other people, how do you drive human performance, which is what coaching and leadership is. It's driving the performance and excellence of others. So it's for coaches to really think about and become more self-aware of their own characteristics, how they are in different environments when under stress and when under not. In coaching, no matter what the sport, there is a very limited off-season. So you've got to be able to flex is probably the wrong word, but you've got to be able to manage your motivation, manage your fatigue, and understand how you are when you're stressed, when you're fatigued. The more self-aware you are of that, the more able you are to identify, and problem solve. If you work with a sports psychologist or whatever it might be, the more you're able to then help your own performance better. And the way, if you can help your performance and relate better in a different way to others, then the better the outcome likely will be for the athletes that you're working with. There's a number of different more specific training programs that people could implement around these different things, identifying where people might be, to then either increase or reduce different characteristics, different ways of relating to others. But certainly, to me, there's an awful lot of lessons and really exciting, information that has come out of these studies, again, reflected in the work won the British Psychological Society's PhD of the Year award and the Loughborough University's award for research and applied practice. So, there's lots of really exciting things to come out of it that I think not just coaches, Olympic coaches, but also, football managers within different, in the healthcare setting, in education setting. To me, there's an awful lot of, I was invited to do a talk with NHS leaders, so clinical directors, around the lessons from this work that they can then bring in to the healthcare setting. So there's lots of really exciting offshoots and certainly exploring different projects and different research lines at the minute to really build on this research around how do we enable leaders to create conditions that other people will thrive and deliver optimal performances.
And my very final question, therefore, because you mentioned that word self-awareness, from your experience of conducting these research projects, would you say the three measurements that you used, the big five, the dark triad, the emotional intelligence, are a useful series of measures, a useful structure, if you like, for people to reference, for coaches to reference, to become more self-aware? And I say that understanding that perhaps not, obviously there are plenty of grassroots coaches listening in who will say, well, I don't necessarily have access to those, but anybody can pick up Dan McAdams' book about personality development that details the big five. You can go online and get some details around dark triad, and you can do an emotional intelligence test. So would you say those three measures, whether it's just reading some books on them, whether it's actually doing the test themselves, are a useful set, they will give you a useful set of data to help you build self-awareness?
Certainly this studies and this research project suggests that these are areas that do seem to make a difference, and there is an impact of these different psychological aspects, ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of behaving, is very real. You know, coaches themselves, swimmers at the highest level, are noticing that these things seem to make a difference. So certainly as a starting place, being more self-aware of these particular traits, characteristics, behaviours would be a great place to start. Enhance self-awareness to then identify how you may be behaving or relating to different situations, to then really work on enhancing your own practice and different things within the within your coaching or leadership spheres that will help your performance, which then will ultimately help create a more positive, dynamic, energized environment that those around you will really thrive within that space.
And on that basis, then, how can people find you, get in touch, who are interested in this area? I know you're on social media because we follow each other. So what's, if I may ask, what's your Twitter handle? And if you'd like to be found, how can you be, or if you'd like someone to get in touch, how could they get in touch with you?
So my email address is g.m.cook@lgmu.ac.uk, and would love to hear from anyone that's been particularly interested in this area of research, whether it be from sport, from education, from health. It would be certainly keen to get in touch with different people and share ideas. And on Twitter, my Twitter handle is at Dr Jill Cook, and again, I would be delighted to speak to different people. Certainly this is an area that I absolutely love. I find fascinating, and certainly love having different conversations and throwing around different ideas on these topics. So would absolutely welcome anyone getting in touch, and can have some great and exciting conversations from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gillian Cook. Jill, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thoroughly enjoyed that.
Well, everybody, wasn't that absolutely fascinating? I really do hope you enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.